Two children learned to read in the same year, same school, same teacher, same books. By third grade, one of them was reading chapter books alone before bed. The other was still sounding out sentences. By fifth grade, the gap between them was so wide it would never close. Not because one child was smarter, not because one worked harder, but because of something that had happened in the first 6 months of first grade that neither of them would ever know about. One got a small head start, and the head start did the rest. This is the Matthew effect, and once you see it, you will find it everywhere you look. The name comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verse 29. For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away, even that which he hath. It was written as a parable about spiritual stewardship. It was not written as a description of how literacy develops in 6-year-olds. But in 1986, a sociologist named Keith Stanovich read that verse and decided it was the most accurate description of what he had been watching happen inside classrooms for a decade. He named the effect after it and published his findings in a paper that would quietly reshape how researchers understood reading, intelligence, and the compounding nature of early advantage. Stanovich was not studying poverty or privilege in the way those words are usually used. He was studying something more mechanical than that. He wanted to know why two children with nearly identical cognitive profiles at age 5 could end up so different by age 10. The answer he found was not in their genes or their homes or their teachers. It was in the structure of learning itself. Here is the mechanism. A child who enters first grade with a slightly stronger vocabulary finds reading fractionally easier. Because it is fractionally easier, they do it slightly more. Because they do it slightly more, they encounter more words. Because they encounter more words, their vocabulary grows faster. Because their vocabulary grows faster, reading becomes easier still. The cycle feeds itself. Every pass through it widens the gap between that child and the one who started just slightly behind. Stanovich called it a reciprocal relationship between reading skill and reading volume. A better reader reads more. Reading more makes them a better reader. The advantage is not linear. It compounds, like interest. The child who struggles in the early weeks reads less. Because they read less, they encountered fewer words. Because they encounter fewer words, their vocabulary grows more slowly. Because their vocabulary grows slowly, new words and new books remain harder to decode. The difficulty does not stay constant. It increases. The gap does not stay the same size. It widens every year automatically, with no additional force required. By the time both children reach middle school, researchers estimated that a strong reader would encounter roughly 1 million more words per year in print than a weak reader, not in assigned schoolwork. In all the incidental reading that comes from being the kind of person who finds reading easy enough to do voluntarily. 1 million words per year compounding. This is the part that is challenging to fully absorb. The gap between those two children was not created by anything you could point to on a single day. No single teacher failed one of them. No single lesson was missed. The gap was created by a process so gradual and so structural that it produced catastrophic outcomes from almost imperceptible beginnings. A slightly rocky start in October of first grade. A few weeks of finding it harder than the kid in the next seat. A slightly shorter time spent with a book at night. That was enough. The mechanism took it from there. Stanovich had identified something that the education research community had been circling for years without naming cleanly. The rich get richer in reading, in vocabulary, in the cognitive scaffolding that reading builds, background knowledge, attention span, the capacity to follow a complex argument across many pages. All of it compounded forward from a starting advantage so small that no one would have thought to intervene on it. The effect does not stop at reading. In 1968, the sociologist Robert Merton had already documented the same pattern in scientific careers. He had been studying how academic credit was distributed when multiple scientists made the same discovery at roughly the same time. What he found disturbed him. The more famous scientist almost always received the bulk of the recognition, even when the lesser-known scientist had done comparable or sometimes superior work. The famous one had name recognition. Name recognition brought invitations to speak. Speaking built more name recognition. The citations flowed to the already cited. The grants flowed to the already funded. The opportunities accumulated around the people who already had opportunities. Merton called it the Matthew effect, before Stanovich did. He was describing scientific prestige. Stanovich borrowed the name because the mechanism was identical. A small early advantage. A self-reinforcing cycle. An outcome at the end that looks like it was the result of vast differences in quality or effort, but was in large part the result of compounding from a moment so early that nobody was paying attention to it yet. The The pattern has since been documented in professional sports. Researchers studying the birth dates of elite hockey players in Canada found a striking anomaly. A disproportionate number of the best players in the country were born in January, February, and March. The cutoff date for age group youth hockey in Canada is January 1st. A child born in January is almost a full year older than a child born in December of the same eligibility year. At age 9 or 10, that physical difference is significant. The older child is bigger, faster, and more coordinated, not because of genetics, but because of 11 months of additional development. The older children got selected for the better teams. The better teams had better coaching. Better coaching produced faster improvement. Faster improvement led to selection for elite programs. By the time the children born in January and the children born in December were both 18, the January children received years more of high-quality instruction, competitive experience, and coaching attention. The gap looked like talent. It was not talent. It was 11 months and the compounding of every advantage that came after it. The same birth date clustering has been found in European football academies, in American baseball, in academic tracking programs, and in gifted and talented identification systems in schools. In every case, the mechanism is the same. The initial difference gets processed by a system that rewards the slightly ahead with more of what makes you further ahead. This is what is easy to overlook. People encounter the Matthew effect as a story about inequality, and they are not wrong to read it that way. But the researchers who documented it most carefully were not primarily making a political argument. They were describing a feature of how complex systems process small initial differences. The system does not need a villain. It does not need anyone to intend an unfair outcome. It needs only a feedback loop and enough time to run. Stanovich himself was not a pessimist. He spent the rest of his career not lamenting the gap, but trying to locate the precise point in the cycle where intervention was possible. What he found was that the window was early and it was narrow. A child who received intensive targeted reading support in the first and second grade, before the gap had widened into something structural, could be pulled back into a trajectory where the feedback loop worked in their favor instead of against them. The same compounding that widened the gap could be reversed, but it had to happen before the gap became the child's identity. Before the struggling reader had spent enough years being a struggling reader that they had stopped reaching for books entirely. He also found something harder to act on. The children who needed early intervention the most were systematically the least likely to receive it. Because the gap was small in the beginning, it was easy to explain away. He just needs a little more time. She'll catch up. The intervention that could have changed everything was not dramatic enough to justify on the evidence available in October of first grade. By the time the evidence was dramatic enough, it was too late for the intervention to fully work. The verse in Matthew was written as a warning. Most readers take it as a description of how the world is. Merton read it as a description of how institutions behave when no one is paying attention. Stanovich read it as a description of what happens inside a child's mind every year from age 6 onward when the conditions are not deliberately corrected. They were all looking at the same thing. A small advantage in a system with a feedback loop does not stay small. It grows at an accelerating rate until the person who started slightly ahead looks from the outside, like they were simply born to be there. And the person who started slightly behind looks but from the outside, like they were never really trying. Neither of them chose when they were born. Neither of them chose the first 6 weeks of first grade. Neither of them understood what was being decided in that window because neither of them was old enough to understand anything at all. The mechanism does not care about that. But we are old enough now to understand it, and that changes what we are responsible for.